The Omega who awakened the Alpha King after 200 years of sealed sleep. Part 1. The Weight of Stone and Silence. The cold never left her bones anymore. Nessa had stopped noticing it the way she'd stopped noticing the ache in her knees from kneeling on stone, the way she'd stopped noticing the silence that pressed against her ears like water, thick and suffocating. 10 years of descending these stairs before dawn, 10 years of lighting candles in the lower crypts where the air tasted of old death and older magic, 10 years of existing in the spaces between the living and the dead. She was 22 years old, and she could not remember warmth. Her hands moved through the familiar ritual without thought, lighting each candle along the western wall where the most ancient dead were interred, nobles whose names had been worn smooth by time, their stone faces watching her with blank eyes. The flame stuttered in her grip, and she noticed, distantly, that her fingers were shaking again. It happened more often lately, this trembling that started in her hands and worked its way up her arms until her whole body felt like it might fly apart. Sister Gwendolyn said it was weakness, that she wasn't drinking enough of the bitter tea they served each morning, the medicine that was supposed to keep servants healthy in this place where sickness clung to the walls like moss. Nessa had been 12 when they brought her here, when her world had ended in ways she still couldn't fully remember. The memories simply stopped, cut clean as a blade through cloth, everything before the monastery gates lost in a fog that never lifted. She remembered hands, rough and urgent, pushing her forward. She remembered crying until her throat bled. She remembered the first time she'd drunk the bitter tea, how it had burned going down, honey-sweet venom that made her sleep for 3 days. When she woke, the crying had stopped. Everything had stopped. The monastery of silent sisters had swallowed her whole, and she had learned to survive in its belly. The sound of her own breathing echoed off the vaulted ceiling as she moved deeper into the crypt, past the sections she cleaned daily, toward the furthest chambers where dust lay thick as snow. This was her favorite time, these stolen moments before the other servants woke, before Sister Gwendolyn's cold eyes found her and invented new cruelties disguised as duties. Here, alone with the dead, Nessa could almost pretend she was a person instead of a possession. She knelt beside a tomb marked with symbols she'd taught herself to read, years of stealing moments with the ancient texts in the monastery's library, learning by candlelight the languages of the dead. The priests thought her illiterate, too lowborn to know letters, and she had never corrected them. Knowledge was the only thing she owned that they hadn't taken from her. The stone beneath her knees was ice, even through her worn skirts, but she stayed there, tracing the inscriptions with cracked fingers, losing herself in words that spoke of honor and glory and loves that transcended death. Lies, probably, pretty lies carved into stone to comfort the living, but they were beautiful lies, and beauty was scarce enough in this place that she hoarded each scrap of it like a merchant hoards gold. Still wasting time with fairy stories, are we? Nessa's heart seized. She hadn't heard Sister Gwendolyn approach, hadn't heard anything over the sound of her own breathing and the whisper of her fingers on stone. She stood quickly, too quickly, and her vision swam with dark spots. 8 hours since her last dose of the medicine. Medicine. Her body was starting to notice. Sister Gwendolyn stood in the archway, backlit by torchlight, her round face wearing its usual expression of pleasant malice. She was 35 and soft-looking, the kind of softness that concealed cruelty the way velvet conceals claws. The High Priestess wants to see you, but first the Eastern Corridor needs scrubbing. On your knees, girl, and do it properly this time, or you'll do it again with salt water. Salt water on hands that were already cracked and bleeding. Nessa had learned not to argue, had learned that words only made things worse, that silence was armor and invisibility was survival. She nodded, dropped her gaze, made herself small and forgettable. But as Sister Gwendolyn swept past, trailing the scent of incense and spite, something unfamiliar stirred in Nessa's chest. It felt like anger, but distant, muffled, as if it were happening to someone else. She pressed her palm against her breastbone, feeling her heart beat against her hand, and wondered when she'd become so numb that even rage felt like a memory. The eastern corridor took 3 hours to scrub, her knees screaming against the stone, her hands leaving pink streaks in the water. When she finally finished, the morning bells were ringing, and she'd missed breakfast. Again. Her stomach had stopped complaining about hunger years ago. High Priestess Morvenna's chambers were in the highest tower, a deliberate cruelty that forced Nessa to climb 7 flights of stairs on legs that shook with exhaustion. By the time she reached the carved door, her vision was swimming again, her body crying out for the medicine she should have received at dawn. Enter. The voice was cold as the stone surrounding them, and twice as hard. Nessa pushed open the door and stepped into a room that was warm, actually warm, heat radiating from a massive hearth that must have cost a fortune to keep burning. The injustice of it, the casual waste while servants froze in their selves, struck her with unexpected force. High Priestess Morvenna stood by the window, tall and gaunt, her iron-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She was 54 years old and looked like she'd been carved from the same stone as the monastery itself, all sharp angles and cold surfaces. Her slate-blue eyes fixed on Nessa with the intensity of a raptor spotting prey. "Come here, child." Nessa obeyed because she always obeyed, because disobedience meant pain, and pain meant nothing anymore, but obedience at least meant survival. She stopped 3 paces away, as she'd been taught, eyes lowered, hands clasped. Morvenna circled her slowly, and Nessa could feel that gaze cataloging every detail, weighing and measuring. "Look at me." She raised her eyes. Morvenna's face was unreadable, but something flickered in those cold eyes, something that might have been satisfaction or might have been hunger. The High Priestess reached out with skeletal fingers and tilted Nessa's chin up, turning her face toward the light. "Your eyes," Morvenna murmured, and there was something strange in her voice, something almost like wonder. "The gold is stronger today. You're late for your medicine." "I'm sorry, Your Holiness. It wasn't a criticism." Morvenna released her chin and moved to her desk, where a silver cup sat steaming. The bitter smell of the medicine filled the room, making Nessa's stomach turn. "Drink." The tea burned her throat as it always did, but today it seemed to burn deeper, spreading through her chest like liquid ice. She gasped, and Morvenna caught the cup before it could fall. "The dosage may need adjusting," the High Priestess said, more to herself than to Nessa. "After 10 years, the body builds resistance. We can't have you unstable." Nessa wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to ask why she needed medicine at all when she'd never been sick, wanted to ask 1,000 questions that tangled on her tongue and died there. Instead, she whispered, "Yes, Your Holiness. You may go. And Nessa," Morvenna's smile was thin as a blade, "stay out of the lower crypts. Some doors are sealed for a reason." That night, alone in the storage room that served as her cell, Nessa lay on her thin mattress and stared at the moon through the barred window. Her body ached in ways she couldn't name, her bones feeling too large for her skin, her blood moving too fast through her veins. The medicine usually made her sleep, but tonight it had done the opposite, leaving her vibrating with an energy that had nowhere to go. She pressed her fingers against her neck, feeling her pulse jump beneath the skin, and thought about doors that were sealed for a reason. thought about the discrepancy she'd found yesterday while cataloging the crypt inventory, the chamber that appeared on the oldest maps but not on the current ones, as if someone had deliberately erased it from record. Thought about how she'd survived 10 years in this place by being invisible, by being obedient, by being nothing at all, and wondered, with a desperation that terrified her, how many more years she could survive this way before there was nothing left of her to save. The moon watched through the bars, cold and distant and free, and Nessa watched it back and did not sleep. Part 2. The Forbidden Descent. Sleep never came. Nessa lay in the darkness, her body humming with an energy that felt wrong, felt other, felt like something trying to claw its way out from beneath her skin. By the time the moon had traveled halfway across her small window, she'd given up pretending rest would find her. The pull she'd been ignoring for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer, had become impossible to resist. A thread wrapped around her ribs, tugging her down, down, down toward the places she'd been forbidden to go. She rose in the deep hours before dawn, when even the most devout sisters were lost to sleep, and moved through the monastery like a ghost haunting its own life. The keys at her belt, the ones Sister Gwendolyn had forgotten to collect after the day's humiliations, felt heavy as sin. She should return them. She should go back to her cell. She should be obedient, invisible, safe. Instead, she descended. The lower crypts were darker than usual, her candle throwing shadows that moved like living things against the walls. The air grew colder with each step downward until her breath came out in white clouds and frost crept along the edges of the stone. This was wrong. It was summer above ground, but down here, winter had never left. You shouldn't be here. Nessa spun, nearly dropping her candle, and found Brother Finn emerging from a side passage. He was 28, with kind brown eyes perpetually stained with ink from his work in the archives, one of the few people in this place who'd ever looked at her like she was human. His auburn hair was disheveled, and he carried a leather journal filled with papers that rustled as he moved. "Neither should you," she whispered, because sound felt dangerous here, felt like it might wake something that should stay sleeping. His smile was brief and nervous. "I couldn't sleep either. Nessa, how much do you know of this place? About what it was built on top of?" "Stone," she said. "Just stone and death." "No." He moved closer, opening his journal with hands that trembled slightly. The pages were covered in drawings, copies of old texts, symbols that made her eyes hurt to look at directly. This monastery was built 200 years ago, almost to the day. Before that, this was sacred ground to the wolf packs, to the old supernatural kingdoms. There are stories, legends about what happened here, about who's buried in the deepest chamber. Nessa's heart was beating too fast, that wrong energy in her blood singing louder. The sealed chamber, the one that's not on the current maps. Finn's eyes widened. "You found it too? I've been searching for months, trying to match the old architectural plans with the current layout. There's a space, a gap in the foundation that shouldn't exist. Unless," he trailed off, looking at her with something like fear, "unless something was deliberately hidden." They shouldn't go further. Every instinct of survival that had kept Nessa alive for 10 years screamed at her to turn back, to forget, to return to the safety of ignorance. But that thread around her ribs pulled tighter, and beneath the fear, something else stirred. Curiosity, hunger, a desperate, aching need to find something, anything, that made sense of the wrongness she'd felt her entire life. "Show me," she said. They found the passage behind a false wall in the lowest accessible crypt, hidden behind a tomb that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The stone swung open with surprising ease, as if it had been used recently, revealing stairs that spiraled down into darkness so complete, Nessa's candle seemed to dim in protest. The descent felt endless. The temperature dropped until Nessa's teeth chattered, and her fingers went numb around the candle. Finn walked beside her, translating the inscriptions carved into the walls in languages she didn't recognize, his voice growing quieter with each revelation. "These are warnings," he whispered. "They say, here lies the tyrant king, betrayed by his own blood, sealed until the world ends. But there's something else, another inscription beneath, older. It says, only true mate's touch shall break the bonds, only destined soul shall wake the sleeper. Nessa, I think this is a tomb for someone who's not dead." They reached the bottom. The chamber before them was massive, carved from living rock and covered entirely in ice, despite being deep underground. Silver chains crisscrossed an enormous door, each link inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. The metal itself looked wrong, tarnished black in places, as if it had been burned. "Silver," Finn breathed. "Spelled silver. This is a prison, not a tomb." Nessa stepped forward, compelled by something beyond reason, beyond choice. The thread around her ribs had become a rope, had become a chain of its own, pulling her toward that door with inexorable force. 8 hours without her medicine, 9 now. Her body was waking up in ways she didn't understand, senses sharpening, skin hypersensitive, a burning in her blood that felt like recognition. "Don't touch it," Finn warned, but the words came from very far away. Her fingertips brushed the door's surface, and the world exploded. Light, blinding and golden, erupted from the point of contact. The silver chains shrieked, a sound like metal screaming, and shattered into 1,000 pieces. Nessa felt something tear inside her chest, felt a barrier she hadn't known existed rupture like a dam breaking, and power, raw and overwhelming, flooded through her body. She screamed, or tried to, but no sound came out, her voice lost in the roar of magic that filled the chamber. The door burst open, hinges that hadn't moved in 2 centuries giving way like paper. Ice exploded outward in a wave of frozen shrapnel. And from the darkness beyond came a presence so immense, so utterly overwhelming, that Nessa's knees buckled. The wolf that emerged was impossibly large, easily the size of a horse, its fur the color of moonlight on snow, silver white and luminous even in the dim candlelight. Its eyes, amber gold and ancient, fixed on her with an intelligence that was completely, terrifyingly human. Finn was backing away, his journal fallen and forgotten, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been curses. But Nessa couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare into those golden eyes and feel something inside her respond with a violence that was almost physical. The wolf circled her slowly, never breaking eye contact, its massive body moving with a predator's grace. It was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from it, could smell pine and winter and something wild that made her head spin. Close enough that when it lowered its head and breathed against her neck, she felt every hair on her body stand on end. And then it changed. The transformation was brutal and beautiful, bones cracking and reforming, fur receding to reveal pale skin, the massive form compressing down into something merely human-sized, though no less intimidating for the reduction. Within seconds, a man knelt where the wolf had been, naked and breathing hard, his platinum silver hair falling past his shoulders in a tangled curtain. He raised his head, and Nessa looked into a face that was all sharp angles and fierce beauty, a face that belonged in the old stories, in legends about kings and monsters. He was tall, she could tell, even kneeling, and powerfully built, his body carrying the kind of strength that came from centuries of violence survived. The scar across his left eyebrow, she would learn later, was from a silver blade, a permanent reminder of betrayal. But it was his eyes that destroyed her. Those amber gold eyes that saw through her, into her, past every wall she'd built around the broken thing she'd become. They widened with something like shock, something like recognition, something like grief so profound it made her own heart crack in sympathy. "Impossible," he whispered, and his voice was rough from disuse, accents strange and archaic, words shaped differently than modern speech. "You smell like, but she's dead. She's been dead for—" He stopped, pressed a hand against his chest as if in pain, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were blazing with golden light. "What are you?" "I don't know," Nessa heard herself say, and it was the truest thing she'd ever spoken. "I don't know what I am." Something snapped into place between them, a sensation like a rope pulling taut, like two pieces of a broken whole slamming back together with enough force to shatter worlds. Nessa gasped, stumbling backward, but the connection held, stretching but not breaking, a golden thread that she could suddenly see, binding her heart to his. The man surged to his feet with inhuman speed, closing the distance between them in a single stride. He grabbed her shoulders, not gently, but not quite roughly, his hands shaking against her skin, his whole body vibrating with barely contained violence. "Mine," he snarled, and it wasn't a word so much as a growl, something animal and absolute. His eyes were pure gold now, no white visible, and Nessa realized with distant terror that the man was losing himself to the wolf, that the creature she'd awakened was barely holding on to human rationality. "My mate. Mine. Who took you? Who hid you? Who dared?" "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know what she was asking for. The burning in her blood had become an inferno, every nerve ending alight with sensation, her body responding to his proximity in ways that terrified and compelled her in equal measure. "I don't understand." 200 years, he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I've been sealed for 200 years, and I wake to find—" He stopped, breathing hard, visibly fighting for control. His hands gentled on her shoulders, though they didn't release her. "What's your name, Omega? Tell me your name." "Nessa," she managed. "Nessa Hartwell." Something flickered across his face. Recognition or pain, she couldn't tell which. "Hartwell," he repeated softly. "The bloodline survives. After everything, somehow." He closed his eyes, and when they opened again, they were still gold but more human, intelligence winning over instinct by the thinnest margin. "I am Callahan Frost, Alpha King of the Northern Kingdoms, and you, Nessa Hartwell, have just become the most dangerous person in this world." Part 3. Fractured Awakening. Consciousness returned to Nessa in fragments, sensations arriving before understanding. Cold stone beneath her back, the acrid smell of burned metal, a presence beside her so vast it seemed to have its own gravity, pulling at something deep in her chest. She opened her eyes to find the chamber transformed. Ice melted into pools of water, the silver chains reduced to twisted slag, and Callahan Frost sitting against the far wall, watching her with eyes that flickered between amber and gold like a candle in wind. "You fainted," he said, his archaic accent making the simple words sound formal, strange. The bond's awakening overwhelms those unprepared for it, especially Omegas who don't know their own nature. Brother Finn was pressed into a corner, his face pale as parchment, clutching his journal like a shield. "This isn't possible," he was muttering, over and over, a prayer against impossible things. "Werewolves are extinct. The purges 2 centuries ago. Everyone knows. Everyone says." "Everyone lies," Callahan interrupted, his voice carrying command that made even Nessa straighten despite her confusion. Or, everyone was lied to, which amounts to the same thing. He turned his attention back to Nessa, and the intensity of his focus was almost physical. "How long have they been suppressing you? You reek of nightshade and silverleaf, poison disguised as medicine." 10 years, Nessa whispered. Her throat was raw, her voice unfamiliar to her own ears. Everything felt raw, actually, as if a layer of skin had been peeled away, leaving her hypersensitive to textures, sounds, the very air moving across her face. "Since I was 12. They said it was to keep me healthy. Something dangerous moved across Callahan's face, a rage so profound it seemed to age him despite his agelessness. They've been harvesting you. Omega essence, tears and blood, the rarest magic, worth more than gold to those who know how to use it. He stood with fluid grace, despite having been imprisoned for 2 centuries, and Nessa realized he was naked, utterly unself-conscious about it, in a way that spoke of different times, different customs. Who leads this place? Who holds authority here? High Priestess Morvenna, Finn supplied, his voice shaking but growing steadier. As Scholar's curiosity began to overcome his terror, she's ruled the monastery for 30 years. She's descended from one of the founding families. Old blood, they call it. Noble lineage from before the kingdoms fell. Callahan went very still, predator recognizing prey. What family name? I don't know. It's never spoken. Only that her bloodline has served the monastery since its founding. Finn hesitated, then added, 200 years ago, almost exactly. The sound that came from Callahan was not human, a growl that resonated in Nessa's chest like thunder, making her bones vibrate. The wolf was close to his surface, she realized, barely contained beneath that pale skin. They didn't just seal me, they built a temple over my prison. They've been feeding off my power for 2 centuries, and feeding off her. He looked at Nessa, and for a moment his expression softened into something that looked like grief. You look like her, like my Alara. The same eyes, the same scent beneath the poison. Hartwell, you're of her sister's line, aren't you? I don't know, Nessa said, frustration breaking through her fear. I don't know anything. My memories stop at 12. Everything before is just gone. Not gone. Taken. Callahan approached her slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. And when she didn't, he knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel the unnatural heat of his skin. His hand came up, hesitated, then gently touched the side of her neck. His fingers were cold despite his body heat, and she realized they were trembling. There. Do you feel it? The emptiness? She did. A hollow space she'd never noticed because it had always been empty. A gap in her sense of self that she'd thought was just what being alive felt like. What is it? Your bond mark. Every Omega has one. A place where your mate's claim settles, where the pack connection anchors. His thumb traced the spot with a devastating gentleness. Yours was stripped, burned out with magic, probably when you were a child, before you could remember what it felt like to be whole. Tears came without permission, hot against her cold skin. She'd spent 10 years learning not to cry, because tears in this place were just another thing to be punished for, another weakness to exploit. But these tears were different. Grief for something she hadn't known she'd lost, rage at a theft she couldn't remember. Callahan made a low sound, distressed and protective, and pulled her against his chest. The embrace was unpracticed, awkward, as if he'd forgotten how to offer comfort. But his hand cupped the back of her head, and his presence settled around her like a blanket. And for the first time in 10 years, Nessa felt almost safe. I don't understand any of this, she said into his bare shoulder. Yesterday I was human. Today I'm… What? What am I? Omega, Finn said softly from his corner, his scholar's mind clearly piecing together facts from legend. In the old hierarchy, before the purges, werewolf packs were structured in 3 tiers. Alphas at the top, leadership and warriors, betas in the middle, the majority of the population, and omegas at the foundation, rarest and most valued. They were healers, peacemakers, the ones who could soothe an alpha's rage or strengthen pack bonds. They were sacred. They were targets, Callahan corrected bitterly. When the purges began, omegas were killed first. Their power could be harvested, used by those with the knowledge. Kill an omega, take their essence, and you could fuel magic for decades. He pulled back enough to look at Nessa, his eyes human-colored. Now, but no less intense. You should be dead. If Morvenna knows what you are, why are you still alive? The answer came to Nessa with horrifying clarity. Because killing me would be wasteful. Better to keep me alive, keep me producing. What did you call it? Essence? The tea they make me drink, the one that burns? I have to cry afterward, every time. They collect the tears. Callahan's hands tightened on her shoulders, and she heard stone crack somewhere behind him, his control slipping. How long has she been doing this? How much has she taken from you? 10 years. Every morning, sometimes more if Sister Gwendolyn decides I need extra medicine. Nessa felt detached from her own words, as if she were describing someone else's torture. Is that why I'm always cold? Why I can't remember what warmth feels like? Partially. The nightshade suppresses your wolf, keeps you from shifting, from accessing your nature. But the essence harvesting? Callahan looked away, jaw clenched. It's killing you slowly. Another few years, and there won't be anything left to harvest. You just fade. Silence fell, heavy with implications. Finn broke it, his voice careful. The texts I've studied say that purges happened because people feared werewolves, that King Callahan the tyrant was planning to conquer all the human kingdoms, enslave everyone beneath his rule. They say he was stopped by his own council, heroes who sacrificed everything to seal him before he could destroy the world. Callahan laughed, bitter and sharp. Heroes? Is that what they're calling traitors now? He stood, began pacing the small chamber with restless energy. I was betrayed by my beta, Marcus, and 4 council members who wanted power I wouldn't give them. My mate, Alara, was already dying, illness the healers couldn't cure, and I was distracted, grieving, not paying attention to the vipers in my own court. They killed her to weaken me further, then attacked while I slept. Used spelled silver to bind me, and Omega's stolen power to fuel the sealing. I woke up enough to fight, but not enough to break free. They sealed me in this tomb and built their new order on my prison. And Morvenna is descended from one of them, Finn concluded. Which means she knows exactly what you are, what's sealed down here. She's been waiting. For what? Nessa asked. Callahan stopped pacing, looked at her with ancient eyes. For someone to break the seal. She couldn't risk doing it herself. The magic was too complex, too likely to kill whoever attempted it. But if an Omega happened to find me, if a destined mate happened to touch the door... He gestured at the destruction around them. The seal breaks cleanly. I wake up confused and weakened, and she has all the pieces she needs to bind them again, this time with my own mate as leverage. The implication settled over Nessa like frost. I was bait. My entire life I've been bait. No, Callahan said firmly. You were a tool they tried to use. There's a difference. Tools can choose to break rather than be wielded. Alarm bells shattered the moment, their clanging echoing down from the monastery above. Finn jumped, eyes wide. They know, someone discovered we're missing. Callahan moved to the chamber's entrance, peered up the long spiral staircase. We need to leave, now, before Morvenna can prepare whatever trap she's planned for 200 years. You're weak, said, and it was true. Despite his commanding presence, she could see the tremor in his hands, the way he leaned against the wall for support. 2 centuries without food, without pack bonds to sustain you. You can barely stand. I'll manage. You'll collapse. Then I'll collapse somewhere that isn't here. His voice carried command again, alpha authority, that made her want to obey, but beneath it, she heard desperation. Nessa, if Morvenna catches us before I've recovered, we're both dead, or worse. She looked at Finn, who nodded reluctantly. There's an old drainage tunnel, leads out past the monastery walls. It's in my notes, I can find it. Lead, Callahan ordered, and despite everything, despite the impossibility and terror and complete upheaval of everything she thought was true, Nessa took his arm when he stumbled and followed Brother Finn into the darkness. Part 4. The Price of Freedom. They almost made it to the drainage tunnel. Almost. The monastery's courtyard was still dark, dawn an hour away, the stones slick with summer dew that turned everything treacherous. Callahan was leaning heavily on Nessa now, his breathing labored, the 2-century sleep and immediate awakening taking their toll. Brother Finn led them through shadows he knew from years of midnight research, his journal clutched tight against his chest like it contained salvation instead of just history. Sister Gwendolyn's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Stop right there." They froze. Guards emerged from doorways Nessa hadn't known existed, 6 of them in the monastery's dark purple livery, hands on sword hilts. Sister Gwendolyn stood at the top of the courtyard steps, her soft face wearing an expression of vindictive triumph. Behind her, the massive doors of the monastery's main hall opened, spilling torchlight across the stones. High Priestess Morvenna descended the steps with the slow certainty of someone who'd already won. She wore ceremonial robes tonight, deep purple so dark it was nearly black, embroidered with silver symbols that hurt to look at directly. Her iron-gray hair was loose around her shoulders, and in the torchlight, her gaunt face looked almost skeletal. 200 years, Morvenna said, her cold voice carrying across the courtyard. 7 generations of my bloodline have waited for this moment. Did you truly think I wouldn't have every exit watched, Callahan Frost? That I wouldn't know the instant the seal broke? Callahan straightened, despite his weakness, and even diminished, his presence was immense. The air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained violence. Morvenna, you have your ancestors' eyes. Marcus always did have cold eyes. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a visionary, Morvenna replied. He understood that the age of tooth and claw was ending, that humanity's time had come. He built this new world on your sleeping body, and we've thrived. You built a lie and fed it with stolen power. Semantics. Morvenna's gaze shifted to Nessa, and something like satisfaction crossed her features. The little Omega performed exactly as predicted. The moment I saw her eyes 10 years ago, saw the gold beneath the hazel, I knew what she was, knew what she could do if properly positioned. Finding her was the work of decades. Keeping her alive and useful, the work of years. But patience is a virtue my bloodline has mastered. Nessa felt those words like physical blows. Every kindness that had kept her alive, every moment she'd been spared worse torments, all of it calculated. All of it leading to this moment. You killed my family. You took everything from me. Your family died in the purges like all the others. I simply found you before you could die too. And I've kept you comfortable, haven't I? Fed, sheltered, alive. You should be grateful. The rage that surged through Nessa was new, clean, and sharp as broken glass. For 10 years, she'd swallowed anger, buried it deep where it couldn't hurt her. But the suppressants were 24 hours out of her system now, and the wolf she hadn't known existed was stirring beneath her skin, lending strength to fury. Comfortable, she repeated, voice shaking. You called that comfortable? Alive, Morvenna snapped, which is more than I needed you to be once the seal broke, but waste not. She made a gesture, and the guards advanced. Take Callahan, kill the monk, bring the Omega to the ritual chamber. Everything happened at once. Callahan moved despite his weakness, surging forward with speed that should have been impossible. His body rippled mid-stride, beginning a transformation he didn't have the strength to complete, stuck between forms, bones cracking audibly. He caught the first guard with a half-shifted hand, claws rending armor like paper, and his roar shook the windows in their frames. But there were too many guards, and he was too weak. Silver chains, prepared and waiting, wrapped around him before he could fully shift. He screamed, and the sound tore at something in Nessa's chest, the bond between them blazing with his pain. "Stop," she heard herself say. "Stop, I'll cooperate. Just stop hurting him." Morvenna smiled. "There, that wasn't so difficult." "No," Callahan's voice was a snarl, barely human. "Nessa, don't give her what she wants." But Nessa was stepping forward, hands raised in surrender, because watching him suffer was worse than any torture Morvenna could devise for her. "I'll come with you. I'll do whatever you need. Just let him go. Let them both go." An admirable offer, but unnecessary. Morvenna nodded to Sister Gwendolyn. "Secure them all. We move to the circle at first light." Brother Finn's voice rang out, surprising everyone. "Wait, I know what you're planning. I've read the texts, the old rituals. You need Callahan bound willingly, or the spell won't hold. You need him to submit." Morvenna's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her cold eyes. "The monk has been doing his research. Yes, forced binding never lasts. But with his mate's life hanging in the balance, I suspect King Callahan will be very cooperative." "I've been reporting to you," Finn continued, and Nessa's heart sank. Another betrayal, another lie. "All my research, I've been bringing it to Sister Gwendolyn. Every discovery about the seal, about Omega magic, about binding rituals. You think I did that because I was afraid? Obviously. I did it because I wanted you confident, distracted." Finn's hand moved to his belt, pulled out a small vial of something that glowed faintly green in the torchlight. Essence of nightshade and silverleaf, concentrated. The same poison you've been feeding Nessa for a decade. In small doses, it suppresses. In large doses, it kills. And this, High Priestess, is a very large dose. He threw the vial at Morvenna's feet. It shattered, and green smoke erupted upward in a cloud that enveloped her and the guards closest to the steps. Their screams were immediate and horrible. In the chaos, Finn grabbed Nessa's arm and ran. "Move," he shouted to Callahan, who was already tearing at the silver chains despite the burns they left on his skin. "The tunnel, eastern wall, behind the herb garden. Run." They ran. Nessa supported Callahan on one side, Finn on the other, half carrying him through passages he shouldn't have been able to navigate in his condition. But adrenaline, line, and desperation were powerful medicines, and behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew. The tunnel entrance was barely wide enough for a child, let alone a man of Callahan's size. They squeezed through, scraping skin on stone, emerging into pre-dawn grayness that felt like a blessing after the monastery's shadows. The forest loomed ahead, dark and wild and free. They were 20 paces into the trees when Callahan collapsed. His legs simply gave out, all the borrowed strength used up, and he fell hard enough that Nessa felt the impact through the ground. Blood leaked from the silver burns on his wrists and neck, and his breathing was shallow, labored. "We have to keep moving," Finn said, looking back toward the monastery. "She'll send hunters. She won't stop." "He can't," Nessa replied. "Look at him. He's barely conscious." Callahan's hand found hers, squeezed weakly. "Leave me, both of you. Get away while you can." "Not happening." Nessa looked at Finn. "Help me get him deeper into the forest. There has to be somewhere we can hide, somewhere we can rest." They found a cave as the sun rose, a shallow depression in a rocky hillside that was barely more than an overhang, but it offered concealment and shelter from the light rain that had begun to fall. They got Callahan inside, and he immediately lost consciousness, his body shutting down to conserve what little energy remained. Brother Finn built a small fire with shaking hands while Nessa examined Callahan's wounds. The silver burns were deep, still smoking slightly. His pale skin blistered and raw around them. She had no medicine, no supplies, nothing but the filthy hem of her dress to tear into bandages. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I don't know how to help him." "He needs food, real food, meat to rebuild his strength. And time." Finn sat back on his heels, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I'm sorry, Nessa. I'm sorry I made you think I'd betrayed you again. I had to make it convincing. You saved us. I delayed them. There's a difference." He looked at his empty hands, the journal lost somewhere in their flight. Everything I learned, it's all in my head now. No proof, no evidence, just a monk's word against a high priestess. Nessa touched Callahan's forehead, felt fever burning beneath his skin. Tell me what you learned. Tell me everything. Over the 3 days that followed, their lives became strange and small, measured in hours of sleep snatched between watch shifts, in handfuls of berries that barely counted as food, and the slow, agonizing process of Callahan's recovery. Finn taught Nessa to hunt, or tried to. She was clumsy and loud, a lifetime of stone floors making her movements all wrong for the forest. But desperation was a harsh teacher, and by the second day, she'd managed to snare a rabbit. The sight of its death made her cry, but she skinned it anyway, fed Callahan the raw meat because they couldn't risk a fire large enough to cook it. He ate with his eyes closed, and afterward whispered, "Thank you." That night, fever delirious, he called her Alara, his dead mate's name in her voice, reaching for Nessa's hand in the darkness. "Don't leave me," he murmured. "Not again. Can't lose you again." "I'm not her," Nessa said softly, but she held his hand anyway, felt his grip tighten even in sleep. The bond between them pulsed with his pain, with confusion, with grief so old and deep it had fossilized into who he was. He didn't love her. He loved a ghost that wore her face. The third day, Callahan woke clear-headed. He sat up slowly, touched the bandages Nessa had wrapped. Ed around his wrists met her eyes with his own that were fully amber now, human and aware. "I'm sorry. I called you by her name. That was cruel. You were dying. Still cruel." He looked around the cave, at Finn sleeping by the entrance, at the meager pile of supplies they'd gathered. How long? 3 days. Morvena's hunters came close twice, but we hid. They'll come again. Callahan stood with visible effort, testing his strength. "I need to find my people. If any survived, they'd seek the old packlands, wait for my return. It's the only chance we have. Can you travel?" "I have to." He looked at her, and something complicated moved across his face. "You didn't have to stay. You could have run, found safety somewhere far from this mess." "Where would I go?" Nessa asked simply. "Everything I knew was a lie. At least with you, I know what the truth is. The truth is that you're bonded to a broken king with nothing left to give you. That's not much of a prize. I'm not looking for prizes. I'm looking for a reason to keep breathing." She stood, met his eyes. "Can you give me that?" After a long moment, Callahan nodded. "Yes, I can give you that." They left the cave as the sun set, 3 fugitives heading toward a future that held nothing but uncertainty, hunters behind them, and wilderness ahead. But for the first time in 10 years, Nessa walked toward something instead of away, and that, at least, was a beginning. Part 5. Blood Remembers. The old packlands revealed themselves gradually over the following week, forest giving way to meadows gone wild, then to structures that were more memory than substance, stone foundations where great halls had once stood, fire-blackened timbers that crumbled at a touch. Callahan moved through the ruins like a man walking through his own grave, touching walls that no longer existed, speaking names of the dead to air that carried no answer back. Nessa watched him grieve and didn't know how to help. The bond between them had grown stronger as the suppressants left her system completely, until she could feel his emotions like echoes of her own, his pain a constant ache beneath her ribs. But feeling wasn't the same as understanding, and she had no frame of reference for loss measured in centuries. Brother Finn catalogued everything with a scholar's instinct, sketching the ruins in dirt with a stick since his journal was lost, trying to preserve what remained of a history the world had tried to erase. "This was a city," he said quietly on the 5th day, standing at what had been a central plaza. "Thousands lived here once, wolves and humans together, according to the oldest texts. A golden age before fear turned everything to ash." "Not fear," came a voice from the tree line, sharp and hostile. "Greed. Fear was just the excuse." The woman who emerged moved like violence contained in flesh, stocky and powerful, her short silver-white hair catching the morning light. She was dressed in worn leather armor, face scarred and weathered, missing her left ear entirely. Steel-gray eyes fixed on Callahan with an intensity that made Nessa step protectively closer to him, which was ridiculous given that he was an Alpha King and she was an Omega who'd been human 3 weeks ago. But the woman's expression transformed, hardness melting into something that looked like wonder, like grief, like hope that hurt to witness. Callahan, gods and devils, Callahan, is that really you? Vera, his voice broke on the name. Vera Coldwater, I thought you were dead. They moved toward each other like magnets, crashed together in an embrace that was as more collision than comfort. The woman, Vera, was shaking, her scarred hands fisted in Callahan's shirt. 200 years. 200 years I've been searching for you, looking for any sign, any trace. Where were you? What happened? Sealed, buried beneath what became a monastery, sleeping while the world moved on without me. Callahan pulled back enough to look at her. Vera, what happened to our pack, to everyone? The joy in Vera's expression curdled into something darker. Dead, most of them. The night of your sealing, Marcus brought human soldiers, hundreds of them, said you'd been planning to massacre the human kingdoms, that he had proof, said stopping you was the only way to prevent war. The pack split. Some believed him, most didn't. Those who didn't believe were killed or scattered. She touched his face gently, checking him for injuries like a mother with a wounded child. I was on the northern border dealing with territorial disputes. By the time I got back, it was over. Just ashes and corpses and lies. Callahan closed his eyes. How many survived? 12 of us found each other over the decades. We've been living in the deep wilderness, avoiding human settlements, waiting, always waiting for you to return. Vera's gaze shifted to Nessa, and all the warmth drained from her expression. Who's the girl? Nessa Hartwell. She's the one who broke the seal. Hartwell? Vera's eyes narrowed. That bloodline was supposed to be extinct. We watched Alara's sister die during the purges, watched her whole family burn. Not her whole family, Finn interjected nervously. Obviously, someone survived, long enough to have children. Genealogy suggests. I don't care what genealogy suggests. Vera circled Nessa like a predator assessing prey. I care that she smells like Omega, like power barely contained, and like the monastery that's been hunting you. How do we know she's not a spy? How do we know this isn't Marcus's bloodline finishing what he started? Because I was a slave there, Nessa said quietly, holding Vera's hostile gaze. Because they spent 10 years draining my blood and harvesting my tears for magic. Because I didn't even know I was Omega until 2 weeks ago. Convenient amnesia. Forced amnesia. There's a difference. Callahan stepped between them before the tension could escalate. Vera, she's bonded to me. True mate bond. I felt it the moment I woke. Something complicated crossed Vera's scarred face. Like Alara? Similar to Alara. Not the same. Callahan's voice was firm. I know the difference between an echo and the real thing. Nessa is her own person, not a replacement. Did he, though? Nessa wondered, but didn't say. Did he really know the difference when he still called out Alara's name in his sleep? When he looked at Nessa sometimes with an expression that was pure grief? Vera made a disgusted sound. Fine, she can come to camp, meet the others. But I'm watching her. She jabbed a finger at Nessa's chest. One wrong move, Omega, and bloodline or not, I'll end you. The camp was another hour's walk, hidden in a valley so remote that even the trees grew differently here, ancient and twisted, like the forest itself was keeping secrets. The 12 wolves that remained were a study in survival, scarred and hard, watching Callahan's arrival with expressions ranging from disbelief to worship. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of new experiences. Nessa was given space in the women's tent, where 5 female wolves regarded her with suspicion that occasionally softened to curiosity. They taught her to fight because, as Vera said bluntly, an Omega who can't defend herself is a liability we can't afford. The training was brutal. Nessa had never raised a hand in violence in her life, and her body protested every movement. But the wolf inside her, still so new and strange, seemed to understand instinctively. By the fourth day, she landed her first real blow on Vera during sparring, and the older woman's grin was sharp as a blade. Again, Vera ordered, and they went again. The shifting came on the seventh night. Nessa woke to agony, her bones feeling too large for her skin, her muscles cramping and releasing in waves. She stumbled from the tent into moonlight, and the wolf inside her surged forward with a violence that made her scream. The transformation was worse than anything the monastery had done to her. Bones breaking and reforming, skin splitting to accommodate new shape, her jaw elongating until she thought she'd choke on her own teeth. It lasted an eternity and ended all at once, leaving her panting on the ground in a form that felt utterly wrong and somehow completely right. 4 legs instead of 2, fur where skin had been, the world rendered in scents and sounds she had no framework to understand. She panicked, tried to shift back, couldn't figure out how. Callahan found her like that, a white wolf trembling in the moonlight. He shifted smoothly, his silver wolf form massive beside her, and the bond between them pulsed with reassurance. He showed her without words how to breathe through the wrongness, how to accept the wolf instead of fighting it. And eventually, hours later, she found her way back to human form and collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. "It gets easier," he promised, holding her while she shook. "Eventually, it becomes as natural as breathing." "How long did it take you?" 200 years ago, I don't remember. But you'll be faster. You're stronger than you know." Over the following week, the pack's hostility toward Nessa slowly transformed into grudging respect. She didn't complain during training. She didn't flinch from blood or violence. She asked questions and learned fast, and proved herself useful despite her ignorance. It wasn't acceptance, not quite, but it was progress. Vera was the hardest to win over, watching Nessa constantly for signs of betrayal. But on the 10th day, after Nessa successfully defended herself against 3 wolves in training, Vera pulled her aside and said gruffly, "You'll do. Don't make me regret saying that." That night, Vera called a council, and Nessa was allowed to attend. They gathered around the fire, 13 wolves and 1 human monk, and Vera produced something wrapped in oiled cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a crown of black iron, ancient and malevolent looking, with symbols etched into the metal that seemed to writhe in the firelight. "This," Vera said heavily, "is what I've been carrying for 2 centuries. Your regalia, Callahan. The crown Marcus took from you before the sealing. I stole it from his corpse 50 years after your imprisonment, been keeping it safe ever since." Callahan stared at the crown like it was a venomous snake. "How did you get it from Marcus?" "I killed him. Took me 60 years to track him down, 60 years to get close enough. He was living as a human lord, fat and comfortable, ruling over land built on our pack's bones. I made it slow." Vera's expression was savage, but before he died, he talked, told me things about the sealing, about the magic they used, told me about the girl they were waiting for. She turned to Nessa. "You, specifically you, Marcus." Arcus knew that Alara's bloodline would produce another Omega eventually, knew that Omega would be the only one who could break the seal. "They hunted your family for generations, and when they finally found you, they decided you were more useful alive than dead. Every drop of essence they harvested from you went into a spell, a binding they've been preparing for 200 years. "What kind of binding?" Finn asked. "The kind that uses Omega Blide and Alpha King's regalia to create a control collar. They want to bind Callahan to Morvenna's will, turn him into a weapon they can aim at anyone who opposes them. With his power and their magic, they could subjugate every supernatural community left in this world." Horror settled over Nessa like a shroud. "The essence they took from me, they're going to use it to enslave him? They already tried once and failed because you weren't there to complete the circuit. But Morvenna won't make that mistake again. She'll come for you both, and when she does, she'll have an army." Vera looked at Callahan. "We need to strike first, hit the monastery before they're ready, Destroy the spell components? End this. 13 wolves against an army? Callahan shook his head. That's suicide. So is waiting for them to come to us. Vera's voice was hard. We've been running for 200 years. I'm tired of running. The debate raged for hours, voices rising and falling, while Nessa sat silent, the weight of her existence pressing down on her. She was the key to everything, the reason Callahan was in danger, the component needed to complete Morvenna's spell. If she simply didn't exist, none of this would be happening. She slipped away from the fire while they argued, walked to the edge of camp where the forest pressed close. The bond with Callahan tugged at her, questioning, but she pushed reassurance back through it, a lie that she was fine. She wasn't fine. She was a weapon pointed at the only person who'd ever made her feel like she mattered, and she didn't know how to save him, except by removing herself from the equation entirely. Footsteps behind her. Callahan's presence settled beside her like gravity, impossible to ignore. I can feel what you're thinking through the bond. Don't. You'd be safer without me. I'd be half alive without you. There's a difference. He touched her chin, turned her face toward his. Nessa, I know I'm not easy to be bonded to. I know I carry ghosts. But you're not responsible for sins committed before you were born. You didn't ask to be a key in someone else's lock, but I am. Then we changed the lock. His smile was grim. We've survived this long, we'll survive what comes next. Together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe survival when the whole world seemed bent on their destruction. But as she looked into his amber eyes, saw 2 centuries of grief and determination warring there, she realized belief didn't matter. She'd chosen to stand with him. That choice, at least, was hers. The attack came at dawn. Morvenna's hunters, 40 strong, surrounding the camp before anyone could react. And at their head, hands bound and face bruised, Brother Finn stood with dead eyes. A compulsion spell traced across his forehead in silver that glowed in the early light. Part 6. The Omega's Trial. The silver net caught Nessa before she could shift, before she could fight, before she could do anything except scream, as the spelled metal burned against her skin. She hit the ground hard, tangled in chains that seared like liquid fire. And through the bond, she felt Callahan's rage ignite. Night felt him start to lose himself to the wolf. "Don't," she gasped, knowing he could hear her through their connection. "Callahan, don't. It's a trap." But he was already moving, already shifting, silver fur exploding from pale skin as he threw himself at the hunters surrounding her. He took down 3 before they got chains on him too, before spelled silver wrapped around his throat and he collapsed, choking, the wolf forced back by magic and metal. Vera and the pack fought viciously, but they were outnumbered 3-1, and Morvenna's hunters had come prepared, with silver weapons, with spelled nets, with magic that turned the clearing into a nightmare of blood and screaming. Within minutes, it was over. The pack subdued, Callahan barely conscious, and Nessa held immobile by chains that burned deeper with every breath. High Priestess Morvenna stepped into the clearing like a queen surveying conquered territory. She looked exactly as Nessa remembered, gaunt and cold, dressed in those dark purple robes that smelled of old magic and older sins. Behind her, Brother Finn stood with empty eyes, the compulsion spell on his forehead pulsing with sickly light. "Quite the chase you've led us on," Morvenna said conversationally. 3 weeks of tracking through wilderness, dealing with your little traps and misdirections. I'll admit, I'm impressed. But all stories end, and this one ends with you in chains where you belong. Callahan snarled something incoherent, the silver choking off his words. Morvenna smiled at him indulgently. "Save your strength, King. You'll need it for what comes next." They were dragged back toward the monastery, a half-day march through forest that seemed to close in around them with every step. Nessa lost track of time, lost track of everything except pain, and the bond with Callahan stretched so tight she thought it might snap. He was being kept separate, hauled in a spelled cage by 6 men, his eyes tracking her constantly, blazing with helpless fury. Brother Finn walked beside Morvenna, his movements jerky and wrong, a puppet dancing on silver strings. Once, his eyes met Nessa's, and for just a moment, she saw awareness there, saw horror and apology and desperate resistance. Then the compulsion dragged him forward, and the emptiness returned. They didn't take her to the familiar corridors of the monastery. Instead, she was pulled down, down, down into depths she hadn't known existed, past the crypts where she'd spent 10 years in servitude, into tunnels carved from living rock that predated the monastery by centuries. The air grew cold and thick, tasting of old magic, of power that had been sleeping in the earth since before humans built their temples. The dungeon cell was small and dark, silver bars that burned if she got too close, stone floor worn smooth by countless prisoners before her. They threw her inside, removed the net, but left manacles on her wrists that seared constantly, a pain that never quite became bearable. She was alone for hours, or maybe days. Time lost meaning in the darkness, marked only by the burning of silver against her skin and the bond with Callahan pulsing with his agony somewhere above her. She tried to send comfort through the connection, but her own pain kept bleeding through, a feedback loop of suffering that neither of them could escape. When Morvenna finally came, she brought light that hurt Nessa's dark-adjusted eyes, torches that threw cruel shadows across the cell walls. The High Priestess stood outside the silver bars, regarding Nessa with the detached interest of a natural philosopher examining an interesting specimen. 10 years, Morvenna said softly. 10 years I kept you comfortable, kept you useful, kept you alive, when it would have been so much easier to simply drain you dry and be done with it. Do you know why I showed such restraint? Nessa said nothing. Speaking felt like giving something away, like offering pieces of herself to someone who'd already taken too much. Because potential is more valuable than immediate gain. Because an Omega who doesn't know her nature can't fight back effectively. And because I needed you intact for this moment, when your power and your bond would make you the perfect component for the greatest working of magic this world has seen in 2 centuries. Morvenna's smile was blade thin. I'm offering you a choice, child. Help me bind Callahan properly, help me harness his power for the greater good, and I'll make you a high priestess yourself. You'll have authority, comfort, respect, everything you've been denied. No, you haven't heard the alternative. Don't need to. The answer is still no. Something flickered across Morvenna's face, annoyance or possibly respect, hard to tell in the torchlight. I'd hoped you'd be reasonable. Ilara was reasonable in the end, once she understood what was at stake. She helped us with the first sealing, did you know that? Gave her blood willingly to fuel the spell that put her mate to sleep. The words hit like physical blows. You're lying. I never lie when truth serves better. Ilara was dying, some wasting illness the healers couldn't cure. Marcus convinced her that Callahan had gone mad with grief, that he was planning to burn the world rather than lose her. She believed him. Believed she was saving everyone, including Callahan himself, by helping seal him away until a cure could be found. Morvenna's expression was almost pitying. She died thinking she'd saved him. Never knew Marcus killed her, poisoned her slowly over months to make Callahan vulnerable. Her last words were, "Tell him I'm sorry." Nessa felt tears on her face and didn't remember starting to cry. For Ilara, who'd been betrayed by everyone, including her own good intentions. For Callahan, who'd lost his mate twice, once to death and once to lies. For herself, bonded to a man who loved a ghost more than he could ever love her. I won't help you, she whispered, I won't be another person who betrays him. We'll see. Morvenna nodded to someone behind her, and Sister Gwendolyn entered carrying a silver tray. On it sat vials of liquid that glowed with sickly green light, the same color as the poison Finn had used to create their diversion. This is concentrated omega suppressant, refined from 10 years of your own essence. Fitting, don't you think? Poisoned by your own power. They forced it down her throat while she fought, while she screamed, while her body convulsed in rejection of what was fundamentally wrong. The drug hit her system like fire, like ice, like every nerve ending igniting at once. Her wolf, still so new and uncertain, recoiled in agony, and the bond with Callahan blazed with shared torment. But worse than the physical pain was what came after. Heat, artificial and agonizing. Omega nature forced into a cycle that should have been years away, her body betraying her at Morvenna's command. The need was overwhelming, humiliating, every cell screaming for an alpha's presence, for relief that only a mate could provide. Through the bond, she felt Callahan's response, felt his control shredding as instinct overrode reason. Somewhere above her, he was tearing himself apart, trying to reach her. And his desperation, Nessa fed her own until she was sobbing on the stone floor, curled around pain that had no outlet. It will get worse, Morvenna said clinically. Without an alpha's presence, forced heat is agony that can last for days. But it can stop, Nessa. All you have to do is agree to help with the binding. One small cooperation, and I'll bring Callahan to you. Let the bond settle, end your suffering. Go to hell, Nessa managed through gritted teeth. Morvenna sighed. Youth is so committed to its principles. We'll see how committed you remain by tomorrow. She left. The darkness returned, and Nessa learned that there were worse prisons than stone and silver, that the body itself could become a cage more inescapable than any dungeon. Time passed in waves of agony, measured in crests of pain that made her scream, and troughs where she could almost breathe. Through it all, the bond with Callahan remained, his presence a constant reminder of what was being used against her, his suffering layered over her own until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. A voice in the darkness, barely audible. Nessa? Gods, Nessa, can you hear me? She forced her eyes open, focused through tears on the cell beside hers. Brother Finn, hands chained above his head, the compulsion spell still glowing on his forehead, but flickering now, fighting against whatever remained of his will. Finn, she whispered, you're still in there. Barely. The spell, it makes me watch while my body obeys her commands, makes me complicit in my own betrayal. His voice cracked. I led them to you. I couldn't stop myself. I'm so sorry. Not your fault. Feels like it is. He shifted, chains rattling. Listen, I don't know how long I can maintain awareness. The compulsion is stronger during the day. But I heard them talking. Morvenna is planning a ritual at the stone circle during the blood moon tomorrow night. She's going to use you as bait, force Callahan to come, then bind him using your combined blood and the crown. If she succeeds, he'll be her weapon for the next 200 years. How do I stop it? I don't know. But Nessa, there's something else. Something I found in the old texts before they caught me. The monastery was built on a ley line convergence, a place where magical energy pools. That's why the seal worked so well, why they could drain Callahan's power for centuries. But ley lines flow both ways. If someone with the right bloodline, someone connected to the original magic, stood at the center during a ritual, they could reverse the flow, take control instead of being controlled. My bloodline, your bloodline, Ilara's sister was a conduit, someone who could channel pack magic, amplify it. If you inherited that ability, he trailed off, the compulsion spell flaring brighter. His eyes went dead again, awareness retreating behind silver light. Serve the high priestess, he said, in a voice that wasn't his, "Obey and be rewarded." Then he slumped, unconscious or compelled to silence, leaving Nessa alone with information she didn't know how to use and pain that kept threatening to drag her under. She lasted another day, or what felt like a day. Time was meaningless here. The heat cycle didn't fade, kept burning through her like wildfire, kept pulling whimpers from her throat that she hated herself for making. Through the bond, Callahan's presence was a constant torment and comfort, his rage and helplessness and desperate need bleeding into her awareness. When they came for her again, she couldn't stand. They had to drag her from the cell, up stairs that seemed endless, into pre-dawn air that felt like a blessing after the dungeon's suffocating darkness. She was thrown into a cart, silver-lined and spelled, unable to escape even if she'd had the strength. The journey to the stone circle took 6 hours, the cart bouncing over rough terrain while Nessa drifted in and out of consciousness. When she woke fully, it was to find herself at the center of ancient stones, chained to a pillar that thrummed with old magic, symbols carved into its base glowing with sickly light. Morvenna stood before her, the crown of black iron in her hands, Brother Finn at her side with empty eyes. Around the circle, 40 hunters stood guard, and beyond them, Nessa could see the forest, could feel through the bond that Callahan was coming. "The blood moon rises in 2 hours," Morvenna said, "and when it reaches its apex, everything changes. For you, for Callahan, for the world. I do hope you've reconsidered your position on cooperation." Nessa looked at the crown, at the symbols, at her own blood that Morvenna had been collecting in vials for a decade, looked at the ley lines she could suddenly see, threads of power converging beneath her feet, flowing toward Morvenna's ritual setup, and realized that Finn had been right. She was standing at the center. She was the conduit. And if she could just figure out how to claim the power instead of being claimed by it, maybe they had a chance. "I've reconsidered," Nessa said softly. "I'll help with your ritual." Morvenna's smile was triumphant and sharp. "Wise choice, child, wise choice indeed." Part 7. When the King Rises. The blood moon rose like a wound in the sky, painting the stone circle in shades of crimson and shadow. Nessa felt its power resonating through the ley lines beneath her feet, through the chains binding her to the pillar, through her own blood that Morvenna was using to paint symbols across the ancient stones. Each brushstroke burned, magic recognizing magic, her essence crying out against its misuse. Morvenna worked with methodical precision, placing the crown of black iron at the circle's northern point, arranging vials of Nessa's collected tears and blood at cardinal directions, her own hands stained red with ritual. Brother Finn stood motionless beside her, the compulsion spell burning so bright on his forehead that Nessa had to look away, the sight of his violated will more painful than her own chains. "He's close," Morvenna said without looking up from her work. "I can feel him approaching. Such rage, such beautiful, predictable rage. Alphas are so simple once you understand their drives. Threaten their mate, and they lose all capacity for strategic thinking." "You don't know him," Nessa said, voice hoarse from screaming herself va in the dungeon. "I know his type. I've studied 200 years of his history, child. Every weakness, every pattern, every place where love becomes liability." Morvenna stood, surveying her work with satisfaction. "The binding will be almost gentle in its way. He'll retain consciousness, retain personality, but his will shall be mine. And with an Alpha King's power at my command, every supernatural creature left in this world will kneel or burn." The forest exploded with sound. Howls, dozens of them, rising in harmony that made the stones themselves vibrate. Nessa felt Callahan through the bond, felt him close now that his presence was a physical weight against her senses, felt the moment he saw her chained at the circle's center, and his control shattered completely. They came from the trees like a silver tide, Callahan in the lead, massive in his wolf form, eyes blazing gold with feral light. Behind him, Vera and the pack, 12 wolves moving with coordinated violence. But there were others, too, creatures Nessa had no names for, beings of vine and stone and shadow that moved with the forest's own rhythm, ancient things responding to an alpha king's call. 50 against 40, Morvenna observed calmly. Better odds than I anticipated. Activate the barrier. Her hunters moved in unison, slamming staffs into the ground at precise points around the circle. Silver light erupted upward, forming walls that separated the battlefield, cutting Callahan off from his pack. The barrier was one way, designed to let him in, but nothing else, funneling him toward Nessa like water through a channel. He came anyway. Of course he came. The bond pulled him forward despite the obvious trap, instinct overriding the tactical awareness that had made him a king. She shifted mid-stride, wolf becoming man, naked and blazing with barely contained power. The silver barrier let him through, then sealed behind him, trapping them together in the circle's heart, while outside, battle raged. Vera's voice rose above the chaos, shouting orders, coordinating the pack against superior numbers. Steel rang against steel, wolves snarled, and the freed supernatural creatures fought with a fury born from centuries of imprisonment. But Nessa couldn't focus on any of it, couldn't look away from Callahan as he stalked toward her, every line of his body screaming violence and desperation. "Let her go," he snarled at Morvenna, words barely human. "Let her go or I tear this place stone from stone." Empty threats from an empty king. Morvenna raised the crown of black iron, began chanting in a language that predated human speech. The symbols painted in Nessa's blood began to glow, responding to the ritual's activation. "Come closer, Callahan. Come to your mate. Let the bond pull you to exactly where I need you." He moved forward because he had no choice, the bond an invisible leash dragging him toward Nessa. She could feel his struggle, feel him fighting with everything he had against the compulsion, but bonds were older than will, deeper than reason. His hand reached out, touched her face with devastating gentleness, despite the violence radiating from every other part of him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Nessa, I'm so sorry. I should have kept you safe." "You did," she said, and meant it. "You gave me a reason to fight. That's more than safe. That's freedom." Morvenna's chanting reached a crescendo. The crown lifted from its resting place, floated through the air toward Callahan, silver light streaming from its black iron surface. This was the moment, the culmination of 2 centuries of planning, where she would place that crown on his head and bind him to her will, using the mate bond as anchor. Nessa felt the ley lines thrumming beneath her feet, felt the power flowing through her blood toward Morvenna's spell, felt herself being used as a conduit for Callahan's enslavement. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to resist, to break the chains and run. But Finn's words echoed in her mind. Conduits work both ways. Someone with the right bloodline could reverse the flow. She stopped fighting the magic, stopped resisting the pull of power through her veins. Instead, she opened herself to it, embraced it, let it flood through her until she was burning with energy that had nowhere to go except where she directed it. The chains on her wrists cracked, not broken, but claimed, silver responding to the Omega authority in her blood. "What are you doing?" Morvenna's chant faltered as she felt the power shift, felt control slipping. "Stop! You can't! You don't know how!" "I'm Alara's blood," Nessa said, voice resonating with borrowed strength, with 10 years of stolen essence returning home. "I'm the conduit you built this ritual around, and I'm taking back what you stole." She reached through the bond to Callahan, not to drain, but to connect, to offer partnership instead of parasitism. His power answered hers, alpha and omega magic intertwining, the way they were meant to, the way they had before. Fear taught people to separate and conquer. The crown, still floating mid-air, began to shake, the binding spell fragmenting. Morvenna screamed in fury and turned to Brother Finn. "Stop her! Kill her if you must, but stop her now!" Finn moved with the compulsion's terrible speed, drawing a silver blade from his belt, advancing on Nessa with dead eyes and shaking hands. She could see him fighting behind that blank expression, see his will struggling against the spell carved into his flesh. Callahan moved to intercept, but Morvenna's magic caught him mid-stride, silver chains erupting from the ground to wrap around his legs, his arms, his throat. Not enough to hold him long, but long enough for Finn's blade to reach Nessa's heart. The knife descended, and Nessa did what she'd learned from weeks of pain, from forced heat and violated will, from every moment of powerlessness that had defined her existence. She reached out with Omega authority, not to command, but to connect, to remind Finn that he was more than the compulsion spell, that his will mattered, that choice existed even under duress. The blade stopped inches from her chest, Finn's hand frozen in trembling resistance. The compulsion spell on his forehead blazed bright enough to burn, fighting against his defiance, but cracks appeared in the silver light, fractures spreading like lightning across glass. "I'm sorry," Finn gasped, words torn from his throat with visible agony. "Nessa, I'm so sorry. I can't. "You can," she said softly. "You already are." The compulsion shattered with an audible crack, silver light exploding into fragments that dissolved into nothing. Finn collapsed, the blade falling from nerveless fingers, his forehead bleeding where the spell had burned itself into his skin. But his eyes, when they opened, were his own again. Morvenna's scream of rage was inhuman. She abandoned the ritual's careful structure, reached directly for the crown, intending to force it onto Callahan's head through brute magical strength rather than elegant binding. The black iron responded to her bloodline, to 2 centuries of her ancestors' power poured into its making. But Callahan was free now, the chains broken by Nessa's reversed flow of power. He surged forward, caught Morvenna's wrist before she could complete the crowning, his grip crushing, his eyes pure molten gold. "You know what the difference is between a tyrant and a king?" His voice was granite and winter wind. "A tyrant takes power. A king is given it freely by those who choose to follow." He ripped the crown from her grasp, threw it to Nessa. "It's yours by right of blood and sacrifice. Do with it what you will." Nessa caught the crown, felt its weight, felt 200 years of stolen power humming through the black iron. She could keep it, could claim its authority, could bind Morvenna the way Morvenna had tried to bind them. The temptation was there, sharp and seductive. Instead, she channeled the leyline power she'd claimed, the essence stolen from her over a decade, everything Morvenna had taken and tried to use for enslavement. She poured it into the crown until the metal glowed white-hot, until the binding spells carved into its surface began to melt, until 2 centuries of accumulated magic had nowhere to go but back to its source. The explosion was more light than force, a pulse of pure energy that swept across the circle, over the battlefield beyond, washing through every person present. The spelled barriers shattered. The hunter's enchanted weapons went dead and cold. And Morvenna, standing at the epicenter, screamed as the power she'd built her empire on was stripped away, leaving her human and powerless and small. She fell to her knees, aging visibly as magic that had sustained her for decades abandoned her. The iron-gray hair went white, the gaunt face collapsing into lines and wrinkles, the cold eyes dimming with the realization of complete defeat. "Impossible," she whispered. "You're just an Omega. You shouldn't be able to." That's the problem with your kind. Vera's voice came from beyond the broken barrier, the old warrior limping into the circle with her sword still red from battle. You spend so long thinking about what people should be able to do, you forget to watch what they actually do. The battle outside had ended, Morvenna's hunters surrendering or fleeing once their spelled weapons failed. The pack stood victorious, bloodied but alive, and among them, the freed supernatural creatures waited with hungry eyes fixed on the high priestess who'd imprisoned so many. Callahan looked at Nessa, question clear in his expression. She held his gaze and felt the bond between them, stretched and tested and somehow stronger for the breaking, felt the choice that had always been there beneath the destiny. Justice, she said quietly, not vengeance. She stands trial before those she's harmed. Let them decide her fate. Morvenna was bound in iron chains, powerless and mortal and terrified for the first time in her long life. As they led her away, she looked back at Nessa with something that might have been respect, or might have been hatred. Hard to tell. Maybe both. Callahan swayed on his feet, the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. 2 weeks of recovery undone by tonight's violence. Nessa caught him before he fell, supported his weight despite her own exhaustion, and together they sank to the ground among the ruins of Morvenna's ritual. "Is it over?" she asked. "For now," he replied. "There's still healing to do, trials to conduct, a world to rebuild. But tonight, yes, tonight it's over." Around them, the pack began to howl, a song of victory and grief and survival that rose toward the blood moon. And for the first time since waking in a dungeon 2 centuries ago, Callahan Frost joined them, his voice adding harmony to their chorus, an Alpha King reclaiming his song. Part 8. The Thaw. Nessa woke 3 days later in a bed that was soft, impossibly soft, her body wrapped in furs that smelled of pine and winter and safety. Sunlight streamed through a window she didn't recognize, painting unfamiliar walls in gold, and for a long moment she simply lay there, trying to remember how to exist in a world without chains. The room was small but carefully appointed, carved wooden furniture that spoke of craftsmanship rather than wealth, a fireplace that radiated steady warmth, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Not the monastery's cold stone, not a dungeon's darkness. Somewhere new, somewhere that felt, impossibly, like it might become home. Movement beside the bed drew her attention. Callahan sat slumped in a chair that was too small for his frame, asleep in a position that would leave him aching when he woke, one hand stretched across the furs to rest near hers. Even unconscious, his presence was a weight, an anchor, the bond between them humming with his proximity. He looked terrible. 3 days hadn't been enough to heal the damage done by 2 weeks of recovery interrupted by battle. Silver burns still visible on his wrists and throat, dark circles under his eyes speaking of sleep taken in snatches, if at all. But he'd stayed. Despite his own wounds, despite everything demanding his attention, he'd stayed beside her while she slept. She touched his hand gently, and his eyes opened immediately, amber and alert despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "You're awake. How long?" 3 days. Vera said channeling that much power would have killed a lesser Omega. As it was, your body decided unconsciousness was preferable to dealing with the aftermath. He sat up, wincing at the protest from stiff muscles. "How do you feel?" Nessa took inventory. Exhausted, sore. Her wrists still bore the ghost ache of silver manacles, and the forced heat cycle had left her feeling hollowed out, fragile, in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. But underneath all of that, something else. Something that felt almost like peace. "Alive," she said finally. "I feel alive." Callahan's expression softened in ways that made him look younger, less like an ancient king, and more like a man who'd been given something precious he'd thought lost forever. Good, that's good. Over the month that followed, Nessa learned the shape of her new existence. They were in the old Packlands, she discovered, in structures rebuilt from ruins by Varys people over decades of waiting. Not the grand halls that had stood 2 centuries ago, but something smaller, more practical, homes built from hope and stubbornness in equal measure. The monastery had been dismantled, stone by stone, its prisoners freed and its secrets exposed to sunlight that made them seem smaller, less terrible than they'd been in darkness. Brother Finn, his forehead scarred but his mind his own again, had taken charge of documenting everything, creating a record that would ensure history remembered truth instead of comfortable lies. Morvenna stood trial before a council of those she'd harmed, supernatural creatures who'd spent decades or centuries imprisoned beneath her temple. Nessa attended every session, watched the high priestess stripped of power and dignity both, reduced to a mortal woman facing judgment for immortal sins. The council debated execution, debated imprisonment, debated justice versus mercy, until words lost meaning. In the end, Morvenna was sentenced to service, her remaining years spent using her knowledge of magic to undo the damage she'd caused, bound by oaths and oversight to ensure compliance. It wasn't the dramatic ending Nessa had expected, but watching the former high priestess kneel before those she'd once considered beneath her, promising humble service, felt more profound than any execution could have been. The political situation was chaos. 5 kingdoms built on the lie of werewolf extinction, now forced to confront the truth. Supernatural communities emerging from hiding to demand recognition. Humans terrified of reprisal for 2 centuries of persecution. Callahan was offered his crown back a dozen times by a dozen different factions, each seeing his authority as solution to their particular crisis. He refused every time. I was king once, he told the 3rd delegation, representatives from the Northern Territories, where his pack had ruled. It ended in betrayal and blood. I won't rebuild the same structures and expect different results. Then what do you propose? They asked. A council. Representatives from every community, human and supernatural both. Decisions made collectively, power distributed instead of concentrated. He looked at Nessa when he said it, something complicated in his expression. No more kings, no more khans, just people trying to coexist. It was revolutionary and probably doomed to failure, but they tried anyway. The Council of 9 Voices formed slowly, representatives chosen through processes that varied by community, gathering in the rebuilt Great Hall that served as neutral ground. Nessa attended the sessions, not as representative, but as witness, watching the messy, frustrating, occasionally hopeful process of building something new from ashes. Her relationship with Callahan grew in the spaces between political chaos, in moments stolen from the demands of rebuilding a world. It wasn't simple. The bond made them constantly aware of each other, emotions bleeding through in ways that left no room for comfortable distance. But awareness wasn't the same as understanding. He still dreamed of Alara, still called her name in his sleep sometimes. Nessa heard it and hurt in ways she was learning to accept. Grief for a woman she'd never met, but whose shadow she'd always lived beside. They talked about it one night, sitting by the fire in the small house they'd been given, watching flames paint shadows across walls. I loved her, Callahan said quietly. Loved her for 60 years before the sickness took her. That doesn't disappear just because I've been given a second chance with someone else. I know. But you're not her. You're not an echo or a replacement. You're Nessa, who broke a seal no one else could break, who turned a binding ritual back on itself, who chose to stand when running would have been easier. He looked at her, amber eyes reflecting firelight. I'm not sure I deserve a second chance, but if I'm being given one, I'm grateful it's with you. Even though I come with more problems than solutions, especially because of that. His smile was small but genuine. Perfect is boring. Give me complicated and stubborn any day. The mating ceremony happened on the first full moon after the council's formation, a night when the pack gathered in the Great Hall and bonds were formalized in ways older than kingdoms, older than betrayal. Vera officiated with gruff affection. Brother Finn stood as witness, bearing the marks of his ordeal with quiet dignity, and the 12 wolves of the pack howled their approval. It wasn't like the bonds Nessa had read about in the monastery's old texts, dramatic and overwhelming, 2 souls merging into one. It was gentler than that, a recognition of partnership rather than possession, her identity remaining distinct while connections formed that would last until death and possibly beyond. When Callahan marked her, teeth gentle against her neck, the bond settled into the hollow space she'd carried since childhood, and for the first time in her life, she felt complete. They shifted together afterward, running through winter forest under moonlight, her white wolf smaller than his silver, but no less strong, learning the language of pack that required no words. They hunted together, brought down a deer through coordination rather than individual skill, fed in the aftermath with blood on their muzzles and satisfaction in their bones. When they shifted back to human, tangled together in the snow, Callahan looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been peace. I was so angry when I woke, angry at the betrayal, at the lost time, at a world that had moved on without me. But meeting you, it made me realize something. What? That maybe the point isn't to reclaim what was lost. Maybe it's to build something new from what remains. He touched her face, his hand cold from the snow, but gentle always. Thank you for being what remains, for being worth waking up for. They returned to the stone circle 2 months after the battle, the place where Morvena's ritual had shattered and their lives had changed. The stones stood silent now, symbols faded, the ley lines beneath running clear without the taint of stolen magic. Nessa carried a pouch of seeds, wildflowers native to these mountains, and knelt in the center where her blood had been used to paint binding spells. She planted them one by one, pressing each seed into earth that had drunk suffering, whispering names with each planting. The names of those lost in the purges, the names of prisoners freed from the monastery. Elara's name, her own parents' names, learned from records Finn had found. Names transformed into flowers that would bloom when spring came, life reclaiming ground where death had reigned. Callahan watched without speaking, understanding in his silence. When she finished, they sat together among the stones, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of fire. What happens now? After all the dramatic revelations and battles and political restructuring, what does normal life even look like? I don't know, Callahan admitted. I've never been particularly good at normal, but I suppose we figure it out together, learn what peace feels like after so much war. Will it be enough, a quiet life after being a king? I think, he said slowly, that being king was about power and legacy and 100 other things that mattered to a younger man. But now, after 2 centuries of nothing, after nearly losing everything again, I think quiet sounds exactly right. They stayed at the circle until stars emerged, ancient and indifferent to human concerns, watching with the same dispassion they'd shown for millennia of rise and fall. The bond between Nessa and Callahan hummed with contentment, with challenges ahead and scars behind, with the messy reality of 2 damaged people choosing each other daily. When they finally stood to leave, Nessa looked back once at the ground where she'd been chained, where she'd nearly died, where she'd discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. The place looked smaller now, less significant, as if the act of surviving had diminished its power over her. Thank you, she said to the stones, to the memories, to the girl she'd been before everything changed. For teaching me I could be more than what others decided, for showing me that cages only hold you if you believe they're solid. They walked back toward the village hand in hand, Alpha and Omega, survivors and partners, Two people learning to build something from the ruins left by others' choices. Behind them, the stone circle stood empty and waiting, ready to tell its story to whoever came next seeking answers. And on Nessa's neck, where Callahan's mark rested warm against her skin, the bond pulsed with simple truth. She was free. Not because someone had given her freedom, not because destiny had demanded it, but because she'd seized it with both hands and refused to let go. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and complicated, and entirely their own to shape. It was more than enough. It was everything.